Each year, the visual journalists at the Seattle Times look forward to showing some of our best work and telling the stories behind the still and video images you are about to see. You're in for a real treat this evening, as one of the more recent additions to our photo staff, Daniel Kim, will be showing his work, along with veteran Ken Lambert, who is celebrating his 20-year anniversary at the Seattle Times. Some of you may wonder how our photo and video journalists manage to get the images that they do, be it for a news story, a longer-term project, a quick hit feature, or a sporting event. I don't want to give away any of the stories that they'll be sharing this evening, but I can say that with the exception of unexpected things that happen right in front of them, which they still have to be equipped to respond to, the rest involves doing their homework, communicating with sources and other contacts in the community, collaborating with fellow staffers, such as editors, reporters, and others, anticipating the right timing, and having an ability to see light in its many forms and make it work for them in producing effective photographs and videos. Many of these factors come into play for each assignment. Our staff takes on both physical and creative challenges in their efforts to make photos and video that stand out, provide a sense of place, and an accurate reflection of our community. It is our goal to represent the diversity of the people, places, and wildlife that make up the Pacific Northwest. Our photographers use their highly trained eyes and journalistic minds as they strive to bring you different, often surprising storytelling images that evoke a wide range of emotions and draw you into the moment that they were witnessing. As time has gone on during the pandemic, we've continued working hard to keep our journalists safe, even as mandates have lifted and a sense of normalcy, albeit a new normal, has returned. No matter what, challenges will always present themselves on many different levels, from access to logistics to timing and gaining the trust of a subject. Beyond the preparations that I've mentioned, our photo and video journalists often must rely on their instincts. Some situations require them to make split-second decisions in the moment and hope for the best. I have to say that when you have a super thoughtful group of journalists who do their work with honesty and integrity, things tend to work out for the best much of the time. This event is always a humbling reminder of the responsibility we have as visual journalists representing the Seattle Times in our community. I'm thrilled to be a part of this team and feel honored to call these visual journalists my colleagues. For those of you who follow our work online or in print, thank you for reading the Seattle Times, for your appreciation of our work, and for holding us to the high standards that we strive to achieve. Please enjoy our Pictures of the Year show, and thank you again on behalf of all of us for supporting local journalism. Daniel Kim joined our photo staff in the fall of 2021. His energy and enthusiasm are contagious, and he's an amazing photojournalist. Here he is now to tell you a little bit about his life and his work.
Hello, my name is Daniel Kim, and I am a proud Korean American staff photographer at the Seattle Times. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon, Seattle always felt like an enigma to me. But when I moved here, I instantly knew that this would be my home. I feel like I've had so many full circle moments at the Seattle Times. Erica Schultz was the biggest influence for me to become a photojournalist when I was in college in the early years. Little did I know that she would become a colleague, a dear friend, and a collaborator. Another full circle moment was that back in the day when I was in college, I was supposed to intern at the Seattle Times. But later, I decided to take a full-time job at the Sacramento Bee in California. I am so happy after all of these years later, I came to work back here at the Times. Just a little background, when I started my career in California, I primarily spent a lot of time covering breaking news, whether that be fires, protests, or COVID-19. Even though I spent a lot of time shooting news here in Seattle, my experiences at the Times have given me more time to work on community features, dig a little deeper into a story, and work on longer term projects. I always wanted to work at the Times, and every day feels like a dream come true. I would go to sleep so excited to photograph the next day assignments. The first few months was basically just seeing the city for the first time, experiencing all of the Seattle scenes as new. That was a very beautiful time in my life. Many people told me that feeling of excitement and adoration for the city really showed in my photography. The first time a photo really stuck out to me that I took at the Seattle Times was in the first few weeks of my job. It was a picture of a man named Ramon who was feeding ducks at Green Lake. I've never seen a moment like this in my life. Wow, just to see a man feeding a duck that was standing on his head. It was a very provocative picture in a sense that a lot of people in Seattle had things to say about it after we published it. Roaming the city felt like I had endless possibilities. One day I could be looking for a weather photo and see a beautiful rainbow over Capitol Hill after an aggressive rainfall during an atmospheric river, to another assignment where I'm photographing Colin Kaepernick practicing at UW. This is my dream job and this is my dream city. What I love the most is that my office changes every day, whether that be breaking news, features, sports, or long-term pieces. I will say, I have an unhealthy obsession with the Space Needle. There's an ongoing joke that I am on the Space Needle and Rainbow Beat at the Seattle Times. I have photographed the Space Needle during the holidays with the Christmas tree on top. I've also mapped out when the full moon will be right next to the Space Needle as night falls over the sky. My most memorable picture that I think I took of the Space Needle is with the needle and in the background, the most incredible fiery orange sky. This picture is part of the Pictures of the Year edition of the Pacific Northwest magazine, and it is its cover photo. The picture is not only beautiful and eerie, but it shows the news of the day when the air quality was one of the worst in the nation. It is amazing because the story behind it is I actually went out of my house the day before I took the picture. I saw that the sun was really close to the Space Needle, and I made a mental note. Fast forward to the next day, forgetting that I had that mental note, I walk out at the right time, and I see that the sun is directly behind the Space Needle. I hurried up to my car to get my telephoto lens, and while I was shooting, could you imagine, a float plane passed by. It felt like I won the lottery. I feel like I could not take a more Seattle picture. When I look at the Space Needle, every time it reminds me of that first love and that excitement I have for covering this city. What I love about my job is for the most part, I get to have really fun and interesting assignments. One day I could be covering the President of the United States, Joe Biden, visiting Seattle amongst the beautiful flowers during springtime at Seward Park. Or a few months later, I could be photographing his wife, the First Lady, Jill Biden, walking into the Pacific Science Center, playing and talking with them, and these kids don't know who she is. I spend a lot of my time looking for local community features, whether that be outside a park, at a community center, at a beach, anywhere in public, you'll see me photographing. Some of these photos come in different circumstances. I took this picture of a heron eating a little snack while I was covering a float plane crash on Whidbey Island. Since the search crews were so far away and I was not able to see what was happening, even with the longest lens that we have at the Seattle Times, I decided that I would not be able to get a picture and talk to my editor. And there was just this heron that kept on looking at me. And I knew that I was at a respectable distance with my 600 millimeter and extender. So whenever I take this picture, I thought whenever I look at whether that be a worm or whatever was in his mouth, I thought it always resembled a hook. So this photo always felt like a double entendre to me. Another moment that I photographed at the Times that I think about a lot is when I was covering the long wait times at the vet clinic during the pandemic. I was let behind the scenes where the animals were being treated. I stumbled across a cat that I'll never forget. He had such an attitude and he was in a hyperbaric chamber. His facial expressions totally described how he was feeling since he was being treated for irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. As a daily news photographer, I love photographing weather in the Seattle area. Whether that be a big snowstorm or the freezing rain situation we had a little while back, it almost feels like the whole city closes down. I've been able to find really fun and kind of quirky moments in the community, but my favorite is in the morning when those weather situations happen, to fly a drone and to get how actually the weather has changed the landscape of Seattle. When those situations happen, typically you can't drive around. You can find moments in your own few blocks, if you can, even walk out of your door. I've been able to photograph people making an igloo in Volunteer Park. I've been able to photograph people slipping and sliding down the hill that I live on. I've been able to see people crawling across the street during the freezing rain situation that happened a few weeks back. She was going to a nail salon appointment. But I think that good journalism can happen in your own neighborhood, mere blocks away from your house. I am so blessed to be able to cover our amazing community members. Earlier in 2021, I had the honor of connecting with a Ukrainian family who fled the war and immigrated to Washington. Their friends helped them and hosted them in Covington, and I had the opportunity to photograph them while they were settling down. It was a surprise to me that Anton, the father of the family, was a professional singer. Not only that, he was a winner of the show The Voice in Ukraine. It was important for me that we show the family's journey settling into Washington. It was important for me to go to church with them on Easter, to show Anton, Alla, his wife, and their kids singing during service. I needed to show that they were a musical family, especially knowing who Anton was. I am so lucky that they let me into their lives, and I understand how difficult it is to allow somebody to photograph your family after you just fled war. With this family, they let me into their lives during a very exhausting moment, but they were willing to share it with me in the region, and for that I'll be forever grateful. After coming home from the airport, in this picture you can see a full house. Several kids running around, 4 adults, and a doe-eyed husky. It was a full house with 12 people doing different things all at once. I was able to photograph really small and quiet moments, but still very important nevertheless. In this picture, you can see Yeva and Philip having a very cute moment together while they're playing together in the snack closet. Moments like this make me really love my job. Or even when Alla, their mother, is doing laundry at night after she puts her kids to sleep. Even moments like this, where Anton is waiting for his eldest child to brush his teeth, really warms my heart and shows them settling into Washington. I was able to spend a reasonable amount of time with this family. I got this beautiful moment of them hugging each other before they all went to sleep. And they say they do this every single night. The moment really showed me how, regardless of where you are in the world, home is where your family is. In this story, I was able to photograph very touching moments in their time in America, whether that be small or big. I was able to photograph them playing Jenga together during family game night. I was able to photograph them eating a beautiful Ukrainian dinner. And I was just able to see them in their every single day life. It was really illuminating to see this because it shows the universal love that parents have for their children and how they, despite all the circumstances, found moments in the days to smile. I would say the project that I'm most proud of while I worked at the Seattle Times is the photo essay I published in the Pacific Northwest magazine about how through the pandemic I was able to get closer to my family and my faith. In late 2021, when I moved here to Seattle for the job, I would visit my parents every single week because I was lonely and I just started a job during the pandemic, so it was really hard to make friends. During that time, my brother Arthur and the rest of the family decided to devote their lives to the Lord in such a time of isolation. What a shock to me. A light bulb went off in my mind that I could do a personal project on my family and our faith. I never imagined that it would run in the Seattle Times, let alone in the magazine, but it was several months in the making. During this time as a photographer, I had always been behind the camera, but it seems like for the first time, it was the fourth wall being broken down. Even though I was photographing my family with the same journalistic ethics that I would do with any other family, it almost felt like I was a participant because of the family dynamic. I didn't care if it was published anywhere because it was important for me to document my family's history. And that was the heart behind the project. Even in this picture where my father, Sang Kim, is praying for us before we dive into a deliciously prepared Korean meal, you can see my sister-in-law, Moonju Kim, laughing at me documenting the situation. Most of the time, my family was so used to me just photographing them in the past that when I was photographing them now, they just forgot that I was there. Which is nice because I was able to get raw and real emotions and moments from people in their every single day lives. I remember when my brother was tucking my nieces in to bed, he was reading them a children's Bible story. The one thing about photographing my family is I had unfettered access to whatever they were doing at any time of the day. I was able to go into spaces that most photographers would not be able to go into. And for stories, access is everything. So the fact that I was able to get pictures of my brother reading and praying with my nieces was such a beautiful moment for me. It was also a full circle moment because growing up, I read the same children's Bible that my brother was reading to my nieces. Just being able to be led in that space when my family was praying seemed like an honor. My mother prays every single night, and being in her space, seeing her read the Bible, seeing her pray so earnestly showed me a different side of her. Actually, the whole story that I photographed showed me on a deeper level who my family members were. Through photographing my family, talking to them on a deeper level, interviewing them, and finding more about my family history, I found myself, who is the black sheep of the family, really just getting closer to everyone. I always had a rocky relationship with my family because I always was really different. It always felt like oil and water. But after documenting this story, I realized that my family and faith were the most important aspects of my life. Well, thank you so much for listening to my portion of the Pictures of the Year Conversations with the Seattle Times. I would love to introduce Ken Lambert, veteran photojournalist at the Seattle Times.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I've just marked my 20th year at the Seattle Times and my 39th year as a photojournalist. I'd like to show you some examples of how my career was seemingly strung together at random, but it in fact followed connecting threads born out of my own interests and honed by good editing. I consider my actual start as a journalist with a self-assigned story to cover a small South Yorkshire mining village during the British coal strike of 1984, while still at college and still studying abroad. It would be an early lesson in how to see a single story through different perspectives, and my report showed 4 unique views: the men on strike, the women who were the breadwinners, and the small children caught in the moment, while the coal industry could operate on its reserves and ultimately break the strike. I learned from this essay, beyond photos, I would realize I didn't fully understand the story I was covering and had left England before the story ended. It would inform me as to my visual limitations to come, it also taught me I never had to be ignorant of the story at hand. After a few internships, I began my first jobs at small newspapers in the Washington, D.C. area, where I'm from. I came up with my own ideas and wrote my own stories. This connected me visually to writing stories. You're seeing clips because I feel it's important to show that the goal for photojournalism is publication. Publication of any kind is the high mark for journalism, in my opinion. A critical moment for me came when a DC photo editor realized I had an aptitude for covering politics. And after this photo essay on the congressional Republicans and Democrats at battle, sometimes referred to as the Republican Revolution in the 90s, won a national recognition in the Pictures of the Year contest, I had confidence in this editor's assessment. More awards from the White House News Photographers Association followed, and I even got to visit this guy at his office. I joined the staff of the Associated Press in DC, and this is where my political and news coverage went into overdrive with the Bush administration and anthrax attacks at the Capitol. The AP is also where I became a complete journalist. I was now figuring out stories on my own and being proactive as a visual reporter. My work on the anthrax story is what first appeared in the Seattle Times, eventually parlaying my DC experience into a staff job here. While covering anthrax, I was placed on protective medication, and this entire experience would prove to echo covering COVID-19 almost 20 years later here. While my national political experience didn't hurt to have during election nights. Seattle Times enabled me to return to my roots in community coverage and storytelling using multiple photos again. I no longer wrote stories, but now was an expert at matching my images to a reporter's writing. But I always contributed as a journalist. While covering Elizabeth's nursing studies, I asked to see her Bible because I had a hunch it wasn't in English. Her copy of the New Testament, brought from Sudan, is written in Dinka, a detail I was able to contribute to the report. I mentioned good editing before, and I'd like to elaborate. The term first gatekeeper is an important aspect to my job. What I mean by this is that I'm the very first in a chain of editors, and by being the first editor, I'm given a lot of control, but also a lot of responsibility. I'm also the second editor. In addition to deciding what to photograph, and more importantly, what not to photograph, I narrow my entire take of images down to a manageable number to transmit back to the newspaper for a final edit done by others. In covering the Rat City Roller Girls, I'm making visual decisions very quickly at a practice in this first clip. For me, all photojournalism is rooted in either portraiture or snapshot. In the case of a practice, I went with portraiture since I wanted to have more control of the images. I could pick my own red background, for instance. It happened to be two steel doors. And if I covered up the seam, it would be a nice wet red background. And I also wanted to make decisions about which teammates worked visually well together in a feature pairing, and making sure that the images were different as well. For actual Derby coverage, the action that happened down in Arizona, the decision has been made for me, snapshots. I shot the action and created a portrait of the event in total through editing. For other stories, I've found that sometimes a portrait can be gleaned from a spontaneous moment that has evolved. This kind of photograph often can inform visually beyond what I expected from just a portrait or a snapshot. But I can't work without editors. In 1986, Larry Price at the Philadelphia Inquirer assigned me to cover cricket for the Sunday magazine, where he was photo editor. I didn't see myself covering a sports story like this, but Larry did. It would be the seeds of my Seattle Times Mariners coverage decades later, where I looked past game action and at the personality of the sport itself. And here's some of that Mariners work, which our photo director, Angie, echoed Larry's sentiment and explained to me when I bungled coverage of a game that I was better at this than I thought. Just like my editor in DC who saw a hidden aptitude for national politics, I would discover I had an unrealized ability to cover Major League Baseball. Who knew? Angie did. And through spring trainings and games won and lost, I added another unexpected journalism concentration that was challenging and fulfilling. I'll end this section with Edgar's journey to the Hall of Fame, which Larry Stone accurately predicted would be in 2019, seen in this first clip. Another interesting turn in my career would be mirrored by my interest in covering subjects from overhead. I'm a short person, so this always offered an interesting and unexpected perspective for me. Here's some examples: kayaks from a bridge, firemen at a charity stair climb, a UW pedestrian bridge view looking down during a heavy rainstorm, tea service, and a trip on the Great Wheel to make a before and after viaduct comparison. For a story on food insecurity, I used a downward perspective to show vulnerability. For a polar bear swim, I used a monopod to heighten my perspective and show more of the background. But when former Times photo editor Fred Nelson saw drone pilot in me, I had no idea that I would embrace another accidental concentration in an area of photography I knew little about. I was initially resistant to the idea, but it would add a whole new lens to my kit and give me a freedom in my coverage options I did not expect. It took a lot of study and still does, but I can say I've helped expand the newspaper's coverage and save the Seattle Times thousands of dollars in helicopter services no longer needed. In conclusion, I can give you the secret to a long career in newspaper photography in 3 words: adapt, adapt, adapt. When cell phone cameras offered a possibility to get breaking news photos back to the newspaper in record time, I immediately embraced it. I tried using my phone to photograph features too. In the end, I believe it's not even the camera or the lens that makes the picture. It's not even the photographer. It's the subject matter itself, the people, the events, the history that's happening in our community. I believe I'm an editor before I'm a photographer, and I'm being the first gatekeeper for the reader. I'm editing with the camera. What I'm showing you is something I think is important to see about where we live. Thanks for coming. Thanks for looking at all the pictures. And thanks for 20 years of support, reading in the Seattle Times. I've just had a thrilling time being part of the community here.
Thanks, Ken. It's been awesome working with you for the last 20 years and seeing all of your fine contributions. In addition to photography, our team also produces video coverage at the Seattle Times. Now I'd like to introduce our videos of the year.
They call to us to get out here. I crave the feeling of stinging on my fingers.
We need to be able to provide culturally relevant, healthy foods for our communities.
This is what we were meant to do. This is what they fought and died for.
For us, it's about how do you have living memorials, the past being honored by the present activity.
If you can tap into people's authentic selves and help them remember that they matter, maybe they can see the change.
It's important for people to understand that this is happening and that it's happening again and again.
It's always a pattern, and it's never the first. I have learned that over the many experiences that I've had.
I box, when I spar, I always telling myself that you have this opportunity for training, so you should do this for yourself and for those women in the country that they're not able to do anything.
I know I don't have the standard size that you would expect to see potentially from some other athletes. I want to be the person to say, look at me. I'm a shorter, pudgy girl, and I'm also a national distance record holder, so whatever body you have is the body you're meant to have, and the water doesn't care at the end of the day.
There have been at least 3 other natural hair movements, and this particular movement is more about self-awareness and self-acceptance.
Embrace it all, like be who you want to be. I am just happy that I'm able to provide this service for my community.
23rd and Union is the epicenter of Black Seattle.
Black people have called this community home for 140 years this year.
For me to be able to tell that history and come back and bring that full circle was everything to me.
I think we were on our way to the train station when that picture was taken to Minidoka. The photographers were waiting there. I don't think we had any idea that they were going to use this photograph that was taken by the Seattle Times as a salve to their guilt feelings about what happened. We need to start rewriting our history books maybe and talk about the concentration camps and what happened.
Not being able to use your faucets in your home safely impacts every part of your life. There are days where I just feel like I can't live like this. I can't raise my kids like this.
We put a ribbon on here just to remind ourselves that when you use this tap, that's not safe water. We've drank this water for 14 years. People's lives are going to be permanently changed because of the contamination of our wells.
In this county, there wasn't any other embedded mental health professional in a law enforcement agency. That's a huge part of the whole thing, is having a relationship with somebody. I mean, that's how people trust you to try these new scary steps. No one grew up saying, I want to be a drug addict and a transient. A lot of people have had huge traumas in their lives, and that has made them more fragile and vulnerable.
I had already been very clear that I did not want to have a sexual relationship with him, and he didn't accept that answer. I've held the secret for so long, carried this burden. You know, I wish I had found someone I could have told my secret to and could have made it better for myself at the time and maybe stopped him from doing it again.
When he was a baby, he hit his milestones and he even talked. At like 18 months, he probably had 50 words, and by 2, he stopped talking. That didn't just diagnose him as autistic, but diagnosed him as severely autistic. Being nonverbal automatically disqualifies him from almost everything. Being aggressive disqualifies him for anything and everything. Nothing was available to him. And that's just kind of been a pattern throughout his life, where there's just nothing available. Because nobody really realizes it. They just assume, like, oh, we're in Washington, we take care of people. No, we don't. We need to, but we don't.
It takes about an hour after leaving its cloud for a snowflake to reach the ground. Each flake has 6 sides and a nucleus, a particle of pollen or a particle of dust, fallen in an hour from the icy insides of winter clouds, to glitter on the ground. Such is the life of a snowflake.
Looks like purple snow. You know, that excitement when you first see snow on the ground is absolutely beautiful.
It's a part of who we are. We have a connection to the land, and we need to be able to preserve these practices and our traditional and custom ways.
The cool thing about nettles is that they're food, they're medicine, and they're fiber. Crops of nettles were fertilized and maintained by Northwest coastal ancestors.
And this is all of our spirituality, our foods, our camaraderie, our social fabric, coming together, laughing, joy, all of those things. Our ancestral foods were our economy, it's our trade. We have to train these kids that each and every day we fight for our sovereignty. If you don't come out here and do this, you don't have sovereignty. You're not honoring who you are.
People can be inspired to embrace their power and their agency to shape their neighborhoods, their community, the city, you know, and the world that we live in.
First of all, again, thank you to all of our journalists, we are just so thrilled to be able to bring this moving presentation to the forefront. Let's start with a question that came in to Daniel about sort of how much time you spent with the family from Ukraine, and how long did it take for everyone to be comfortable working around you and just being with you?
I think, so when I look back, I would say I was there for maybe 6 full days. It wasn't so long, you know, they were, of course, very exhausted from, you know, leaving the country and also just settling in their lives. So I spent a little less than a week, but I would say even after day one, I spent a whole day on day one when they came from the airport. They actually started to like forget that I was there after the first day. So, and after that, just more and more, they forgot that I was there and I was just, you know, part of the setting.
Gotcha, great. And kind of questions come in for you. Wondering if you could talk about the importance of being your own first editor. Have you ever felt conflicted about what you choose to file to the photo editors?
Yeah, I mean, my career's been pretty long and it's gone through different stages, and I've gone through every sort of emotion about it. You know, back in the day, it was film, of course, and you didn't even know if you had the image. You hoped you did. And very often I'd be driving back to the paper to go to the dark room, and I would think, oh, I should have looked at this, or I should have asked about that, or I should have, you know. And then now it's more or less, I still miss stuff on the edit. I mean, even today, I shot a picture of a crosswalk where this horrible, fatal pedestrian accident happened with a police officer. And my editor, Bettina, sent me a really nice note saying that was a wonderful detail to get the rose in the picture. There was a single rose tied to one of the traffic stanchions. And I told her, you know, I didn't even know there was a rose in the picture until you just told me. So sometimes I have eyes, but I can't see. So I really need editors. I need, I can do a lot, but I just think that the more people that can look at the work and make a good decision is a good thing, especially at a #1 newspaper.
Great, very interesting. Question to the sort of panel at large, and anybody can jump in to answer this, but are there any photo cliches you try to avoid when shooting?
For the video team, I don't know if it's really a cliche, but something that we try to look for in the stories that we tell is, you know, whose perspective is the story being told from? You know, whose voice are we highlighting. We try to include as many women and people of color or people that aren't very well represented usually in the media. And that's the voice that we're typically looking out for. But again, not necessarily a cliche, but something that we do take in mind whenever we're looking at a story.
Great. And Ramon, I don't know this, but like how big is the video team at Seattle Times? How many videographers do you have?
We're a fairly small team. Right now we're at 3 people. It's myself, Lauren Frohne, and Erica Schultz. Yeah.
Great. Well, Lauren, we're also glad that you could be here with us. Just beautiful images that we just saw. Let's go to another question here on the list. How about the relationship between the photographers and the reporters? Seems like, Gary asks or makes a comment that it seems like a bit of a chicken and an egg, but does one have priority over another? And how close do you work with reporters?
I can answer that. I think when we work with what we really love at the Seattle Times is collaboration, and we hope that we do it for every single story. The more communication, in my opinion, is better. Like some of the reporters that I communicate really often with, we can brainstorm ideas of how to make the package look better, how to get better details, how to get better scene setters. With all of that constant communication, at the end of the day, it leads to more of a great collaboration between the reporter and the photographer. So I think that the more collaboration you have, the better the product at the end is.
Great.
I've always felt that, with great reporters, the total reporter will use their eyes instead of just their ears to ask questions. And the best photographers use their ears and not just their eyes. And very often you might miss a picture while you're asking a question, but you're getting some more information that might help you with the coverage.
So that's a great point, Ken. And it kind of leads to another question that was asked, actually to you, but I guess anybody can answer it. But speaking about sort of like your own emotions when you're in that moment in photographing, and you talked about your experience in the anthrax situation, but have you ever been like scared physically in those positions while you're trying to obtain the coverage?
Oh yeah, it can be a very dangerous job for any number of reasons. Whenever you're going into a situation that it's a new environment, maybe there's an interview set up over the phone, but then I'm the one that has to go and actually get the picture, and it's in a very remote area. Maybe the reporter never even met the person in person, and there's just a lot of things that can go wrong quickly, and you just have to be very, very self-aware in a lot of different situations. It's not just in, what you would think is the normal, dangerous thing like protest situations. It's all kinds of situations.
Well, thank you for putting yourself in those positions for the benefit of the public. Question about whenever we have this event, we have lots of people who love photography and ask us some really good technical questions. But one that came up was in terms of like your own editing and working in a sort of a news cycle, do you guys spend a lot of time sort of editing your photos, or do you kind of get them off to the photo editors pretty quickly? If anybody wants to take that question.
I think the edit is something that just kind of goes story by story. So what's always challenging is to get sort of a mosaic of pictures, a grouping of pictures. And then, of course, video is going to be even more complex because you're also dealing with sound. But what I think is the hardest part for me is the captioning, just making sure that I'm writing good, solid captions that are accurate and fair. And that takes me usually the most time.
Interesting. So Ava asks, what, if anything, is the duty of a photographer or videographer to their subject?
I think I can answer that. I think it's our duty as, community photojournalists to make sure that we're being really sensitive, because some days we can be covering somebody at the best day of their life. Someday we can be led into a situation where we're covering the worst day of their life. So I'm always reframing myself and making sure that I'm always keeping a respectful distance, and also just making sure that we're putting the source, the subject first. And that's something that constantly is something that I ask myself. And if we're not doing that, then we're not really doing the story justice, in my opinion.
I'll also add that, it's no small thing for someone to share their story with us. And like Daniel said, sometimes it's, about the worst thing that's ever happened to them or the best thing. And, it requires a lot of vulnerability from that person to put their story out there. And so I think our duty to them is, to be as accurate, as compassionate as we can be, and make sure that it's a collaborative approach to telling their stories. Otherwise, we're not really fulfilling our side of that collaboration.
You bet.
I really want to emphasize what Lauren said there about, it's about people sharing their story with us. It's not us going in and finding, oh, here's what the story is, I'm going to tell it my way. It's about, finding someone and helping them to tell their story and share it with the public.
So I imagine that for many of our listeners here, like you all just have these incredible dream jobs. And we've had a couple questions about sort of aspirations to get into this field of photojournalism and photography. So can you talk a little bit about advice you would have for, for aspiring photographers?
I would say, look at a lot of pictures and look at a lot of pictures over a long amount of time. Go back to some of the more classic photojournalism of the 60s and the 50s, and sort of really pay attention to how the technology changed the photography, and also how the way the message ended. What did it go into a magazine? Did it go online? Try to delve into those particular nuances and pick your heroes right. I mean, if you have great photographic heroes, not that you're going to copy them, but if you're going to just be inspired by them, I just have kind of a handful of heroes I've had since I was a kid, and they still usher me through to this day.
So as I spoke to earlier, like the Seattle Times, I looked at this, going off of Ken's point, the Seattle Times has always been kind of a beacon of photojournalism for me. Like in college, I learned from Erica Schultz and her work that she did throughout the years. And just to be able to look at new and interesting and different work all the time, and just making sure that you're doing work that you care about too, really, I think is important for young photojournalists to really, because you can see the heart in the photo, and then that's the way that you could probably cultivate your skills as to become a documentary photographer or sports photographer or whatever you want to become.
You bet. Erica's usually a regular on our Seattle Times Pictures of the Year, so we're glad you're giving her the night off tonight. Angela, maybe a question for you. As you sort of think about the year ahead, what are you looking forward to seeing your team photograph or record over 2023?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to more really rich stories that involve the community that we live in. Like Daniel's story on the Ukrainian refugees, or the video piece on, it was in the Yakima area, but on the folks that have to deal with the bad water. There are so many stories to be told in our community, and I just really look forward to diving into more of those. I also really look forward to more of the slices of life that, we see every day. Daniel showed many of those in his presentation, just those little moments of everyday life that are both beautiful and amusing, and provoke a lot of different emotions. I look forward to that. And also just, there's always going to be breaking news around here. And I want to make sure that we're on top of all of that.
In a typical weekday or Sunday times, how many pictures are you including, or how many active photographers do you have out at any given time?
Yeah, well, we have, up to 9 or 10 photographers and videographers out at any given time. As far as the number of pictures that we include in a Sunday Times, in print, dozens, maybe hundreds. In a regular day's paper, dozens. But online, there's so much more reach with online. We're able to include so many more photographs and photo galleries with our stories. So, many, many more on there.
Awesome. Let's take a quick look at our question list. Harriet asked a really interesting question. Describe a time when your emotions took over or almost took over you while shooting on an assignment. That's an open question to our panel.
I'll just say, I feel like most stories I work on, it's just, the whole spectrum of emotions, right? Like you can be really moved by something that isn't particularly sad also, which is, such a unique way to experience the world, is like through other people's stories. I will say, you might have seen in our video reel, recently we worked on a story about a mother, Greta Johnson, whose son had been in the ER, boarded there for a year at that point, because there was no help for him, no place for him to go outside of their home. And reporter Hannah Ferfaro and I, spent time with Greta, and that was just hearing her, being with her in person and hearing her story and going through that motion of going to see her son at the ER. It's just, it was, I think we were both holding back tears most of the time, as was Greta. And so, it can be a really cathartic experience for people to share their stories in that way. And you just can't help but sort of feel that with them.
Yeah, you bet. And another question about sort of like the changing nature of photojournalism and the tools and technology you were using. A couple of you have mentioned drones and how that sort of changed the landscape of your sort of the tools that you have to work with in your job. Does somebody want to comment on sort of the technology that's being introduced and what's coming down the line that might excite you as well?
The drone coverage is interesting because it's so new. We have such a freedom now, where we used to have to decide whether it was even worth renting a helicopter for a couple hours at $250 an hour or whatever it was. I don't even think we've touched on how we can apply the drone coverage yet, because it's just, we use it a lot for real estate stories. We use it, I think I've only used it on breaking news, maybe not even 5 times. It's usually, I've tried a little bit with portraiture. It's just so new, and the technology is just going to get better. Drones are going to get smaller. The cameras are going to get better. So it's just kind of, it's such a relatively new thing that we're just glad we're, involved in it.
Any other thoughts on the tech of your field?
This is less to do with the equipment that I use, but the equipment that the photographers are using. Everyone's is mostly moving toward mirrorless cameras, which can shoot silently now. And as a video person that's always trying to record audio alongside photographers, being able to not have that constant click, click, click in the background while they're taking their photographs has been great. But
that's why I asked for 2, Ramon. I
Yeah.
asked for 2 cameras just for you.
Great. Well, any other closing thoughts from our panelists just about your work or the inspiration you take to the job every day when you help our public and our neighbors sort of understand the human emotions of our work.
I just want to say that without our community, we would not be able to tell any of our stories. And I'm just so thankful every single day that people let us into their lives. And I think that's like, I was working on a project recently, and it was a really kind of hard one to listen to. But, you know, these stories come because people are really vulnerable and they trust us to show their story well. And I'm just so thankful to the Seattle community and the Washington community for letting us into these stories.